we've got some special teachers coming up this spring. They've already got their passages that they're working on and studying for. And so I kind of have a free week to kind of teach whatever we want to, because I can't move to the next passage because that's for a future week. That's for next week. So, got a free week. So, worship team, we're ready. We're ready for you. No. So during this time, I've got a message today, and it's in moments like this, I'm going to believe that it wasn't a mistake, that whatever happened last week, that God was in that, and He had something special for us this week that wasn't part of my plan when I set out the thing. And so during this free week, I'm going to kind of talk about some stuff that I feel like is on my heart. It's been on my heart. It's been an observation of mine for a season here. And so I've entitled this message today, From Fading to Fullness. From fading to fullness. And I want to talk about this today because personally, I'm feeling tired. I'm feeling tired on the outside. I'm feeling tired also on the inside. And as I've been observing on Sundays for the last couple weeks, I don't think I'm the only one feeling a bit tired. Tired on the outside, maybe a season of feeling worn down on the inside. I see this maybe in pre-service prayer a little bit, where it's been a little bit less urgent, a little bit less passionate. We worked on that this evening. If you were here this evening, we were leaning in urgency intentionally. Sometimes worship has been a little bit less fiery than it has been in times past. Maybe I don't think I'm the only one going through this, maybe a season of weariness on the inside or on the outside. One thing that I've learned about fading, feeling like you're fading a little bit on the inside, is that it's natural, but it's also sneaky dangerous. It's also sneaky dangerous, and we need to intentionally push back and fight against it. Often we talk about maybe faith crisis moments, and those are obvious times where something happens to you and you feel disappointed or you feel upset. And in those crisis moments, you got to hold on to faith no matter what happens. You got to hold on to God. Those are an obvious danger moment, but fading is another danger. It's equally as dangerous, but it's way, way, way more subtle, because you just sort of drift a little bit. These past couple weeks for my Bible read-through group, we've been going through 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, and we've been looking at David's life. Mostly, I mean, there's other people in there like Samuel and Saul and things like that, but looking at David's life, and I found David's story this time through a little bit more disturbing than I usually do, because he doesn't end well. He doesn't end poorly, but he just kind of ends so-so. He kind of fades a little bit. When he's young, he's living in this fullness of fire with God and faith, and in all those early years of defying Goliath and all that sort of stuff. But at the end, he just seems to have faded a little bit, to have faded. Less intentional as he ends, not on fire like those younger years. In our generation, when I look at myself and when I look at people around me, it seems like people who are fading, who fade out or fade back a little bit, they tend to be maybe less excited about church as a symptom, just less excited. They still go, but maybe just less excited. They tend to be less motivated to pray with other people, to pray for people. Maybe when you're really excited, you're like, hey, let me pray for you right now. And maybe when you're less excited, hey, I'll pray for you. I'll pray for you someday, if I remember. Also, people fade out, tend to lose their hunger to learn more about God. They tend to lose their vibrancy in their relationship with God. They tend to lose the wow of the gospel. Just the excitement, the joy. God has forgiven me. He has saved me, the joy of their salvation. Bill Thrall, who's an author of several books, he says of people who fade out in life, fade out in their faith, he writes, the stories of their lives are written in invisible ink, leaving no mark on history. Thanks. There's a real danger of just fading out, and I want to fight against that. I want to fight against that person, that pull towards fading. I want to fight against all the days of my life. I want to spend all my life encouraging people to resist that fading and be intentional to live in the fullness of the fire of following God. If you see or if you feel any of those symptoms in your own heart, in your own life, that's okay. It's natural right now, but we're going to talk about pushing against that. We're going to push against that. And in the Bible, I see, I have 7 notes, but I keep adding more as I was sleeping last night and as I was talking to people during today. I'm going to talk about 7 things that I see in the Bible to help us resist fading, that sneaky fading, and help us to live in fullness. Now, before I get to them, I have another confession, something else really embarrassing. It's just not my day. It's not my day, guys. All of these things, when I'm mapping them out, it was pretty obvious. All of these points begin with the same letter. Oh, they all begin with R. It's just mortifying. It's mortifying. And even as I've come up with more throughout today and last night, they also begin with the letter R. It's ridiculous, right? It's just ridiculous. Okay. But so you're going to have to deal with that. I'm dealing with it. I'm dying on the inside. But we're going to keep going. 7 things to move from fading to fullness. Number 1, rest. Rest. Physical rest is spiritually essential. Physical rest is spiritually essential. God says 6 days you will labor and do all your work, but the 7th is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. The God who made you to need and thrive in your faith when it's part of rhythms of rest. You can work hard 6 days and work hard and work as working to the Lord, and then rest as in resting in the Lord. I don't want to say much about this one, but physical tiredness can have a great impact on your fire for God. Young David, he writes in his most famous psalm, he writes about how God makes me lie down in green pastures. Psalm 23. How he causes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He renews my life. We also talk about walking through the valley of the shadow of death, but definitely there's seasons of intensity, there's seasons of trial, but also there's seasons of rest and quiet, lying down in green pastures. Your God calls you to rest, to stop. And when you don't do what he's called you to do, when you resist his directive to stop, it will impact your spiritual life. Every year about this time, I reassess my life pace, because usually I'm a little bit out of control. I've been pushing it a little bit too hard, and I'm like, okay, very often I'm reading a book. How do I get my life pace under control? I'm burning out, I'm frying. Bill Hybels, help me. I don't know. How do I simplify my life? Good thing you wrote a book called Simplify. Okay, let me just read it through. Assessing and reassessing always throughout my life to make sure that I have enough rest in my life and that I'm not out of control. If you're feeling less passion about God these days, is it because you're tired? You're physically tired and you need to make sure you get enough rest. That's one possible factor that leads towards fading. That's one. Another one, the word is return. Return. And this is about returning to your time alone with God, just you and God. And we see this in Jesus, and we see this also in young David. One of the moments in David's life that I've spent extra time thinking about over the years is the time when David's 30 years old. He's 30 years old, maybe 29, but I think he's 30 at this point. And everyone in his life turns against him. All his loyal friends, all his loyal companions for years, they all turn against him in a moment. The same moment his personal life goes through its greatest devastation. It happens on the same day. Everything comes crashing around. Everyone turns against him. What they don't realize yet is that David is just minutes, moments, days from becoming king. And it's his last great trial to see how he handles it. Sometimes in the hardest moments of your life, the most painful moments in your life, the most devastating moments of your life, it's that last test to see if your character is ready, if your resilience is ready, if you're going to run to God in that moment and see if God is ready to entrust you with what's next. Well, David has one of those crushing moments, and he stands right with God. He godly navigates that trial. I just want to encourage you, when you feel like things are crushing in and crashing down, in my experience, those are the most strategic, opportune moments if you pass the test. And I'm going to say that again. If you pass the test, if you stand strong in those moments, whether it's temptation or when life is crumbling down, if you stand strong, sometimes those are the moments where God is about to release you into what's next. That's what was happening with David. He's about to become king, but in the moment, everything's falling apart. See, he went out with his fighting men to go to battle. They didn't actually end up fighting that particular battle, and then when they returned home, they discovered the Amalekites had kidnapped all their wives and children. They'd burned their whole town to the ground. They'd stolen everything. They'd taken everything away. And so this is a brutal moment for David because he's just lost his family, and everything that he had has been burned down. But also, hundreds of armed warriors are wanting to kill him. Now, I've not personally experienced this exactly, but I do know what it's like, and I think some of you also know what it's like when it feels like the world's against you, when it feels like everything is falling apart, and when life just feels too hard. It just feels too difficult. And those moments, they can zap the zeal out of your faith. But what young David does has been a model for me, an encouragement for me, a directive for me in my difficult days for a long time, for a couple decades here. And what it says in 1 Samuel chapter 30, verse 3 is this. It said, when David and his men arrived at the town, they found it burned down. Their wives, sons, and daughters had been kidnapped. David and the troops with him wept loudly until they had no strength left to weep. David's two wives, Ahinoam the Jezreelite and Abigail, the widow of Nabal the Carmelite, had also been kidnapped. David was in a difficult position. Understatement. David was in a difficult position because the troops talked about stoning him, for they were all very bitter over the loss of their sons and daughters. No mention of wives. But anyways, over the loss of their sons and daughters. But David found strength in the Lord his God. And that's the thing. But David found strength in the Lord his God. Other translations read, David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. In this moment, David is a contrast to what is normal. Being upset, but David returns to God. He goes to God. He returns to God for strength, for guidance, for perspective, for help, for direction. We're going to see this all through the life of Jesus as we continue to look at him in the book of John, how he teaches and models a life spending abiding and alone with God. But when your passion fades, when your zeal for God is slipping away, it's time for you to assess your alone time with God. First of all, is it happening? But the question that's more important is this: is it enough? Is it enough for the challenges of your life today? If you spend your whole life saying, I'm going to spend 15 minutes alone with God every morning, that may be great for 70% of your mornings, but it may not be enough for 30% of your mornings. And so you've got to assess your challenge, your crisis, your crunch, and just be like, is my alone time with God enough for today's challenge? Today's challenge. Different seasons, different amounts of challenge. Some seasons just require more. And so is your alone time with God enough to keep your passion for God hot, to keep your fire for God burning bright in these days? The third word, righteousness. Righteousness. And this is righteousness versus rebellion. You cannot sustain a lifetime of zeal and passion and love for God while choosing to live a life with intentional sin and with compromise and with hypocrisy. You cannot keep your fire for God hot with intentional hypocrisy. Your hypocrisy will rob your passion for God. The person who serves the church but is out on Fridays or Saturdays or Tuesdays or Wednesdays shaming God's reputation with drunkenness during the week, your hypocrisy will keep you from being able to live in the fullness of spiritual joy and spiritual freshness. David writes this in Psalm 31, verse 10. He talks about sin and compromise. And all this. He says, my strength has failed because of my sinfulness. He's just talking about this idea. He's faded. He's faded. He failed because of my sinfulness, and my bones waste away. In Psalm 51, when he's dealing with the sin of Bathsheba and he's confessing that adultery, he writes in verse 1, he says, be gracious to me, God, according to your faithful love, according to your abundant compassion, blot out my rebellion, wash away my guilt, and cleanse me from my sin. For I am conscious of my rebellion, and my sin is always before me. Skipping down to verse 10, God, create a clean heart for me and renew a steadfast spirit within me. Steadfast against sin and temptation. Steadfast against sin and temptation within me. Do not banish me from your presence or take your Holy Spirit from me. Restore the joy of your salvation to me. That's what gets lost in compromise and when you're living in intentional sin, when you're living in hypocrisy. The joy of salvation disappears. Disappears. It fades away. It snuffs out your fire for God. If your passion for God is low, how is your righteousness? Are you living with hypocrisy or intentional sin? David knows the path back to fullness with God, or the path back to living with the joy of salvation, includes having that steadfast spirit of integrity, of righteousness, of godliness, and saying no to sin, saying no to hypocrisy. And that's true for him, it's true for us 3,000 years later. Righteousness is one of those incredible, important things to keep our fire for God hot. The fourth one, the word is reframe. Reframe. See, life can be filled with major disappointments. Major disappointment, and disappointments can cause our fire for God to fade. We can be disappointed with life, and we can be disappointed with God. Sometimes, returning to the joy of the Lord, the place of fire for God, includes reframing your life circumstances through the eyes of faith. Reframing your life circumstances, looking at your life and your disappointments through the eyes of faith. Through the eyes of faith. And what I mean is, often we don't understand why God would allow this disappointment, or why God would allow this pain to drag on, or why God would allow this stuff to happen to us. But sometimes it's because God knows things we don't know. Sometimes. Well, he always does, but sometimes that's the reason. Or sometimes it's because God wants us to grow in our character, things like resilience or endurance or reliance or trust or faith, the kinds of things that can only grow under pressure. Under pressure. And you're like, God, I'm not enjoying this pressure. I'm not enjoying this pain. I'm not enjoying this trial. I'm not enjoying this suffering. But God's like, oh, this is good because I'm making you mighty right now. I'm making you strong. For years, David's life was in danger. Sometimes he's being actively hunted by the king who wants to take his life. And what did he do? God, he could be like, God, why am I being hunted? Why is my life in jeopardy? Why am I living in caves? Why am I being betrayed by people from my own tribe, the Zuphites? Why are the village priests slaughtered just because they helped me? Why do my parents have to flee the country and live in Moab? Why? Why is this bad stuff happening to me? Well, because God wanted him to be king, but not just king. He wanted to be a king filled with amazing faith. Faith, the faith that someone who knew that he could trust God to save him out of every adversity. In fact, when he's old, he writes about this. God, you saved me out of my God who saves me out of every adversity. So God wanted him to learn that when he's young. Sometimes painful things happen so that we know that God will rescue us out of them. Sometimes painful things happen so that we know that God will help us keep going as we persevere through them. Sometimes painful and disappointing things happen so that we can learn and grow in all sorts of ways. Can you see how your difficult situations, the disappointing things going on in your life might possibly be used of God to make you more mighty, more trusting, more mature in your faith? Sometimes you just got to look through eyes of faith. Sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's more difficult. My grandfather was in World War II. When he was younger, when he was alive and younger, he was stationed in Alaska. I made a joke about defending Alaska. It turned out terrible because Hadassah's from Alaska, and she was here in the room, and I couldn't recover. Alaska is a big deal. So we were, my dad was, my grandfather, he was a welder. He repaired planes and boats for the U.S. Navy in Alaska. Money was tight, and so at the end of every month, what he would do is he would get in one of the airplanes, and the last day of the month, he'd go out to the airfield, wake up early in the morning, get in one of the planes, and he would go on its survey mission just to make sure everything was fine and that nothing was taking place. And if you did that, then you'd get a great pay bonus. Well, one morning, the last day of the month, he got up early, goes down to the airfield desperately needing the cash, and they said to him, Sorry, Ingraham, the flight's full. Pretty big disappointment for him on that day. He was really banking on that money, but the thing is, the flight never returned. It never returned. Everyone on that flight died. Now, that's an easy one. That's an easy one to move from disappointment to thankfulness, right? In one day you realize, wow, I was so disappointed, but now I'm so entirely thankful for what happened there. Now, he can see that in one day, but so often in our lives, we don't get the joy of being able to identify that in a day, or identifying what's going on in a week, or a month, or a year, or a decade even. But sometimes we just have to trust and reframe our life situations and disappointments through eyes of faith, that something is going on, that God has permitted this, and he can use even this in redemptive ways. Are there situations in your life that has reduced your joy or your fire for God? Do you need to reframe your experience through the eyes of faith, that God may yet be seen to have a good plan, even though it's difficult? That's number 4. The 5th word is remember. Remember. And what do we remember? We remember this everyday significance. That every day is important. This is one that's so easy to lose track of because it's every day. Every day. And so we can forget. My mentor's always driving home, hey, Brian, what'd you do today? And he'll be like, oh, that is so significant. Like, I had lunch with my team, Oh my goodness, that is such a significant thing. God uses small things to make huge differences. When you decide to give money faithfully every month to this church, you don't know where it goes. You don't know what's happening with it. But the more you give, the more we can do. The more we can do, the more lives are impacted, the more people are helped, the more people are changed. When you decide to serve faithfully in church, when you decide to give time and effort, you may not see the result of it, you may not understand, but the more you serve, the more God is going to use you to make more of an impact than you even know. If you stand at the door, if you commit yourself to coming to church early, coming to pre-service prayer, and then being a part of the welcome team, standing at the door, smiling, greeting people, you have no idea the ministry you're having. People come into this building hurting, having terrible weeks. Some people are walking and they don't know God, but they're desperate for any bit of hope. And a bit of love at the front door, a smile, would you like some coffee, starts to minister to people in ways that can lead to transformed lives. You serve in the creche, you serve in kids ministry, you can have no idea about the power of that ministry, especially if you're just looking at with your eyes at that moment. But God does extraordinary things through people who are serving in creche ministry. Again, my grandfather. So my grandfather, he gets back from World War II. He lives through the war. He goes to Seattle. He marries my grandmother, whose name is Grandmother Ingraham. And so they are married. They have a son. Now, neither of my grandparents are Christians. They don't care about God. But my grandfather wants to have his son go to Sunday school. That apparently was important to him. So every week, he took his wee son, like 2 years or less than 2 years old, to church. He's just so small. And I have no idea who it was, but someone at Martha Lake Community Covenant Church 70 years ago or so volunteered in the creche. Volunteered in the creche to watch these babies, to watch these little kids. Did that volunteer have any idea the importance of what was taking place? Did that volunteer have any idea of the multi-generational impact they were having by watching this less than 2-year-old boy in the creche? What happens is they're watching this boy in the creche. My grandfather is sitting in the back row of the church while this is taking place. As he's sitting in the back row, he hears the gospel. As he hears the gospel, over time he responds to the gospel. He gives his life to Jesus. Over time he keeps inviting his wife to come. Finally she comes. She hears the gospel. She gives her life to Jesus. Over time they have more kids. They are raised in this church hearing the gospel. The kids give their lives to Jesus. They marry Christian spouses. They raise their children in churches. That's my generation. And all of them profess Jesus. They marry Christian spouses, and they're raising up the next generation in churches. Right now, we're at least at 4 generations of impact that began with somebody watching a 2-year-old or less in creche, so my grandfather was able to listen to the gospel. You usually have no idea the extraordinary things, in this case, multi-generational impact in the Ingraham family and through the Ingrahams that you might be having by volunteering and by serving in church. I think this is a good moment to plug kids ministry and creche ministry and Sunday mornings to consider being a part of the holiday club. We have had so many kids coming to Christ since January here. Kids coming to Christ. God is in a season of reawakening with kids. They're coming to Christ. They're going to have an impact on their families, their homes, their futures. You want to be a part of that. It's exciting. I'm not sure if this was written by David or not, but Psalm 100 verse 2 reads, "Serve the Lord with gladness." Serve the Lord with gladness. That everyday serving of God. Those are church examples, but when you're in your workplace or when you're in your university or school or wherever is going on in your life, when you live your life with a joy-filled, hope-filled heart, when you say yes to integrity, when you say no to getting drunk, when you smile and give words of encouragement, when you offer to pray for people, when you choose to live with joy and hope, that's powerful stuff. Everyday things like words of encouragement, can I pray for you, saying no, they change people's lives and destinies. Maybe your joy and fire for God is less these days because you don't think you're making much of a difference. Remember, God can use the littlest things, the everyday things, to change a life. Now, this is a bit of an awkward story, at least for me to tell, but it's an example. In the early years of the church, when we were first starting the church, I would go to the university gym and, I'd go to the university gym. Over time, one of the guys in the gym, he started coming to our church after a while. He started coming to our church. Ultimately, he gave his life to Jesus, and he was in our church and Bible read-through groups for several years before he moved away. Well, one day, after a long period of time, he says, "Brian, do you know why I first came to this church?" And he says this, I first came to this church because I was watching you in the gym. And what I noticed was you weren't checking out girls. And I was like, So I came to the church. Ultimately, I gave my life to Jesus. Simple, everyday integrity changed that guy's life forever. It started him on a path. You remember that? Those littlest things can make a massive difference. You may not see how God's using you, but you can be encouraged with faith as you remember that it doesn't take a gospel presentation to change generations for Jesus. He can use the simplest things of intentional people who are committed to serve and committed to live godly lives. There's other ones that I'm not going to mention. Last night as I was falling asleep, this idea of relationships, as far as it's up to you, live at peace with one another. That would be another one. This other one, as I was having a conversation, this idea of revelation, believing in faith, thinking about Joseph and how Joseph was able to have this revelation from God that he could cling to through his difficult times. Revelation being another one of those ways to keep your fire for God hot, believing in the revelation that God has given you. But I'm going to say this for number 6. Those ones are just free. 6 is resist. Resist. Glasgow is an environment that pulls people towards hopelessness. It's one of the reasons why we wanted to make sure that hope was in the name of our church. We wanted to have our church be about hope, as opposed to the hopelessness that we see and perceive in all these lives in our city and our generation. So we sat down, we decided to vote. We voted on naming this church Living Hope. Now, why is it not called Living Hope? There's another story behind that. But anyways, that was our vote. We don't do good with voting around here. But anyways, we wanted our church to be about hope because there's so much hopelessness, a pull towards hopelessness. It's not just Glasgow, though. It's humanity. Since the beginning, the enemy loves to discourage. He loves to steal passion. He loves to steal joy. He loves to steal hope. He loves to steal fire. He loves to cultivate that. He wants us to just do our faith, to be faithful without passion, without fire. If you want to move from fading towards fullness, you need to intentionally resist the natural slide towards fading by choosing to lean into zeal in spite of how you feel. To lean in with passion when you don't feel like passion. To resist it. YWAM people would say it this way. YWAM people would say, by choosing to walk in the opposite spirit. Our nation, our city has a pull towards hopelessness, and so we choose to walk in the opposite spirit by choosing to live in hope, in life, in faith, in joy, instead of depression, discouragement, and those things. The enemy wants your worship of God to be joyless. He wants your prayers to be passionless. He wants your presence at church to be occasional. He wants your serving and giving to be as little as possible. But walking in the opposite spirit is resisting those feelings and choosing to worship with passion, to pray with urgency, and to participate fully. The enemy wants you to be discouraged, but resist and live with a smile, a word of encouragement, with kindness and thoughtfulness. And when you resist living in the opposite spirit of our city, you resist that slide towards fading. As I mentioned earlier, when David strengthened himself in the Lord, he was walking in the opposite spirit. Everyone else was bent on murder, and he was like, no, God, he went to God for strength and for clarity and for direction. Instead of acting on his disappointment, he said, God, what now? What now? If your fire's for fading, choose to resist by intentionally worshiping harder, praying more urgently than how you feel. And that's powerful stuff. That's number 6. The 7th word is rejoice. Rejoice. More specifically, rejoice in what God has done for you and your salvation. You combat fading with choosing joy. David writes this. It's brilliant. Psalm 5, verse 11. He says, but let all who take refuge in you, God, rejoice. Let them shout for joy forever. That's a lot of shouting for joy. God, let your people shout for joy forever. May you shelter them, and may those who love your name boast about you. Psalm 16:11, you reveal the path of life to me. In your presence is abundant joy. Paul encourages us to rejoice in the Lord always. The intentional choosing of expressing joy is powerful in resisting the fading. What do you have to rejoice about? Some of you might not be able to think of anything. You're looking at your life and it's just too painful, just too disappointing, just too horrible right now. Well, if you've given your life to Jesus, you've got the gospel. And if that's all you've got, you have enough. In fact, if that's all you ever have and everything else about life is difficult, that is enough to shout for joy forever. That's enough. That's enough. Never lose the wow of your salvation. That is my tip for you for life, that never lose the wonder of what God has done for us, of his forgiveness, of his mercy, of our undeserved grace. If you can never lose that wonder, you will never lose the ability to rejoice forever. Okay, friends, I'm preaching this. I'm preaching this message for myself. For myself, I'm tired. I'm tired, and I know that I'm not the only one tired. I'm not the only one that's been feeling like they're fading a bit. The call for today is intentionality. To be intentional about moving from fading towards fullness as we consider the moment where we're at. To consider, are we living in a moment with less fire than normal, and what our next steps forward might be. Now, the chances are you don't need to work on all 7 of those things, but maybe some of those, maybe 1 or 2 or 4 or 3 or 5, maybe some of them you're like, oh yeah, I need to cultivate this. I need to lean in. For me, I need to make sure I increase my rest. I've been not doing a good job on that one, and I need to resist the natural pull of this place to walk in the opposite spirit every day. I also am very clear, I don't have this in my notes, but I've got to be continually reframing that with eyes of faith, viewing my life with eyes of faith. That it's so important for me right now to make sure I'm on that one and keeping short accounts with my heart in that. What about you? Which of these 7 things do you need to maybe lean into to rekindle and return to living in with that fire? That's part of challenge number 1. Challenge number 1 is giving attention to which of these 7 things will help you move towards more zeal for God in worship and life. You've heard them. You've heard me talk about them. If you can't remember, just think of all the R words. I'll get there. Secondly, what specific things are you going to do for each of your intentional areas? So I might be like, okay, my rest levels, I wrote this message yesterday on my day off, again, not resting. So what I did after finishing this message, I applied it, and I took a nap. So glorious. I preached it this morning. You know how I applied it? I took another nap. Yes, I'm running to live this, and also when I was taking that nap, I didn't think about this too much. But while I was falling asleep, I was also reframing my life, reframing things with eyes of faith as I was falling asleep, and being thankful in those prayers. What things might you do? Some of you maybe need to deal with the hypocrisy, and you just need to confront yourself. And you're like, you know what? God's called it out today. I am living in hypocrisy, and I need to stop hanging out with these crowds, these people, because I'm shaming God by how I'm living, and I'm not living with integrity and godliness. And some of you maybe just need to be more intentional when you come to this time of worship next, or when you come to pre-service prayer next week, or just I'm going to be more intentional about being urgent and passionate. Sometimes it might just be a return to thankfulness. Jesus, thank you for what you've done for me.